Good evening. My name is Margaret Johnson. I'm the board chair of the Idaho Humanities Council and a professor of English at Idaho State University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion on the changing face of media in Idaho with our speakers Don Day, Christina Lords, and Clint Schroeder. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by my fellow IHC board member, Bill Manny. This presentation is part of the Democracy and the Informed Citizen initiative funded by the Federation of State Humanities Councils through a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We are incredibly appreciative of their support. Before I introduce tonight's guests, I'd like to mention that you can submit questions for our panelists via the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Don Day is the founder and editor of Boise Dev. Founded in 2016, Boise Dev covers the stories of a changing Idaho. From growth to businesses to housing to development, the site helps Idahoans understand the factors that make up the changes they see in their neighborhoods. With a team of reporters, Boise Dev provides coverage of Boise, Meridian, Nampa, McCall, Sun Valley, and the surrounding areas. Christina Lords is the editor-in-chief of the Capital Sun and has been a professional journalist covering local and state government since graduating from the University of Idaho in 2009. A native of Pocatello, Lords is a fifth-generation Idahoan who served as a reporter at the Moscow-Pullman Daily News and the Post-Register in Idaho Falls. And she served as an assistant editor for the Idaho Press in Nampa. She also led the Idaho Statesman in Boise for 2 years before turning to nonprofit journalism. She has 14 writing awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, Idaho Press Club, and USAPA, including first place writing awards for general reporting, column writing, and editorial writing. Clint Schroeder is the Inland Northwest Regional Publisher for Hagedorn Media Group at Hagedorn Corporation. Prior to joining the Hagedorn Corporation in May 2010, Clint was Vice President of Advertising for Hawaii's largest newspaper, the Honolulu Advertiser, for 4.5 years. His newspaper background also includes 8 years managing newspaper advertising departments in Colorado and Illinois. And moderating tonight's discussion is Bill Manny. Bill is a producer at Idaho Public Television and has been a reporter and editor at newspapers in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, D.C., including 18 years at the Idaho Statesman. Bill, I will now turn it over to you to get our discussion going.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to everybody who's joining us live or on this recording, and also thank you to Don, Christina, and Clint. Before we start, I want to point out that if you are interested in asking one of our panelists or all of our panelists a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So click on that and send your questions our way. So all three of when we were talking earlier with the three of you, we talked about one of the things that has changed most in Idaho journalism, and the conversation tonight is the changing face of the media in Idaho. One of the things that's changed the most in recent years is the conditions under which you work. Safety, hostility, attitudes toward the press. And let's start with Clint, but this weekend we saw some of that playing out in your town, where you had this clash between conservatives, right-wing groups who came to town to protest the Pride Parade, and you've seen some of this hostility now in your coverage has been a backlash against law enforcement in your community. So maybe you could walk our viewers through kind of what you've seen happen this weekend, what's happening in your community, and how your staff has dealt with some of these very issues we're discussing.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for having us this evening. Yeah, this last weekend was an interesting time in North Idaho, and I think looking at it from our point of view and our newsroom all of the employees. Our first and foremost priority, of course, is safety, and making sure that our team is taken care of in the field and here in the office all the time. It seems to be more an issue as tensions rise around a lot of these social issues that some that you just named and others. And it kind of clashes internally too with our role as a leader in breaking news, our leader in being as accurate as possible, as balanced and unbiased as possible. And a weekend like this last one, it really put us in a position of, it's better to be last to post and be accurate than it is to be first and incorrect. And I think that is something really important for all of us to look at really closely as we take more and more guff for being fake news and inaccurate statements and whatever we may be putting out there. So this weekend we had some indication that things were getting a little warm around these events, and we went into it consciously thinking we need to be very careful about what we publish. We need to be very careful about the photos that we allow on our social media, making sure that we are as balanced as we can be. Frankly, from the bystander's point of view, maybe it was a day like many others here in town. The event that everybody's, I'm sure, familiar with occurred and was pretty contained in a fairly small area. I think it's important to note that the people involved, most of them, all but two, in fact, of the 31, were not even from Idaho. And that's, I think, something now we're dealing with even more, where the tensions are rising, and it's a global, universal tension, maybe around an issue. We're all on a global stage, and I think that no matter what's happening, we need to anticipate that there'll be participation in whatever that event may be, whether it's virtual or in person, by readers and those with opinions all over the country and even internationally. This event made international news, and I'm really proud of our journalists and our newsroom, the steps they took to be as careful as they could be, navigating this to make sure that it was not only safe for our staff, but the general public, in addition to not overplaying any of these things so that we looked like it was a sensational event. For this to now come back on law enforcement and some of the individuals, especially the chief of police and the county sheriff, it's just disheartening. They did such a phenomenal job making sure that everything was by the book and done. They acted quickly, swiftly, and it couldn't have gone better, I think, from my point of view. However, it's hard now, this doxing thing, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, where your personal information, your address, phone number, those kinds of things may end up in a place you don't want them. Fear is, a human emotion, and everybody, bullies like fear. That's where we're at, and this pulls us to the whole noble job that we have protecting the First Amendment and making sure that I protect your right to say whatever it is you want to say, even when I don't agree with it, as long as it doesn't incite violence. And that's that area of gray maybe getting wider and wider, and that's sort of how I feel about what happened this weekend.
Or did your staff face any direct threats themselves, or has it been at this point directed toward law enforcement?
There have been a few members of our team that have had some doxing things happen. We've had a number of things in the past, kind of coming from the same type of tension and the same edge of this bell curve. The personal threats this time were more general. So I feel like we navigated this well enough.
Okay. Christina, I know that one of the things you and your staff have been wrestling with in the past few years is safety and threats, when in your reporting, and you have to go into decision-making on assignments and staffing, keeping the safety of your staff in the forefront, right? Talk about how you work through that decision-making.
Yeah, I think when I first started as a journalist, people would always kind of look at me and say, oh my gosh, that's unusual, and ask, what stories I was covering or what my beat was, those sort of things. And now when people ask what I do and I say I'm a journalist, it's inevitably negative response. It's, how do you feel about fake news? It's these sort of things. And on the surface, it can seem very, surface level. It can seem not that big of a deal. But when we do controversial stories, a good example is one that we worked with some of our partners at Boise State Public Radio on the Ammon Bundy situation in St. Luke's downtown, where Ammon and his supporters encouraged the shutdown of the hospital in downtown Boise. And we recognized that they were doxing public officials, the judge in that case, law enforcement in that case, the social workers in that case, and we were genuinely worried that these reporters would also have their personal information and their addresses posted online. And we had, at least for our reporter, we talked about, do we need to get a hotel for you to stay in at night so that you feel safe with you and your family? She has a young daughter. These are all things that play into our decision making when we're doing stories. I would say it has a chilling effect on a lot of people because they're just more uncomfortable with taking on really hard issues without knowing who's going to read this and where they're going to post your information about it. I think that's especially true for women that are in this field. I think, and I'm not here to say that men don't get threats and vile things in their inbox as well, but it's just, about a month ago, one of our reporters got an email with the C word just laden through it, and she kind of laughed it off because this is not unusual for her at this point, but it is unconscionable and it is insane that we can't talk to each other. And if you do have genuine questions about the reporting or its direction, we're happy to answer those things. But the rhetoric and that sort of thing does play into the stories that we go after and how we frame them and what our plan is after they're published.
Well, boy, there's lots of right material there for discussion. But let's go to Dawn and ask, have you noticed in the time you've been publishing Boise Dev a change in the culture, the way your news is the reaction to what you do, and have you had either threats or hostility aimed at your folks? You have a niche publication. You are doing less kind of broad national and political coverage and more local political coverage, Don. So what have you noticed along these lines?
Yeah, I would say that our focus is a little bit different. We're in large part staying out of the kind of hot button social issues, but these things really intersect with everything. And 2 years ago, during the kind of the first COVID summer, when fear was high, case counts turned out were low, and people were trying to figure out what to do, there was a lot of consternation. And our office is here downtown, and we cover the city council here in Boise very, very closely. And there was just a strange confluence of events where we had people protesting at Boise City Hall on the night that the city's budget was going to be approved. And you had sort of loose right-wing groups and loose left-wing groups both showing up, and Ammon Bundy had threatened to show up, and the whole kind of local media ecosystem kind of banded together that night. And I remember at the time our Boise City Hall reporter Margaret Carmel, at the time she worked for the Idaho Press, and we have a partnership with the Idaho Press, and this is before I hired her, so a little bit of context there. But their plan was for her to watch the meeting from home. And we also work with Channel 6 here in town, and their news director at the time, Jay Bates, was going to be in person. And I felt it was really important that day to be in the room at the meeting. This is the budget. This is where the city lays out its priorities for the coming year. And, it was during COVID, so masking was happening and a lot of distancing. And being at the city council chambers that day was wild, because there were, probably 30 or 40 cops just in the lobby of City Hall, not to mention all the folks that were outside and people in the chambers. And I remember it was the first time I ever thought to myself, I need to think about where I'm going to sit today. And it used to be I would sit, in the second row. First row is too much. So I'd sit in the second row at city council meetings with my back to the door. And that day I was like, yeah, I'm going to sit where I can see the door. And that's not something I had thought of really before then. And I think it's changed for a lot of people. I have a staff of 5, and we're plus an intern. So we're always thinking about, what are we going to cover? How are we going to cover? What's our approach? What are the plans for people to be safe? Because it's a dynamic situation. And I think it's important to say, it's not just journalism. It's as we talked about, it's law enforcement, it's politicians. There's been a lot of focus on the incidents at the Supreme Court in DC this summer, and the homes of those officials. Officials on both sides of the political aisle and in Idaho have had protests at their home from people on both sides of the spectrum, right? We had left-wing protesters protesting city council people at their home, right-wing protesters protesting Idaho members of the legislature. And so it's a very dynamic and volatile time. And I think there's a lot of professions. St. Luke's Hospital, for crying out loud, they shut down a hospital, that are now thinking about this, that never really did before.
Well, I think a lot of us who went into journalism viewed it as a public service, like politicians, like law enforcement, like hospital workers. And I think finding ourselves being called enemies of the people is kind of a surprise and a kind of a discouraging place to be. Christina, when Clint was talking about how they covered events in Coeur d'Alene, it talked about picking stories and photos and bending over backwards to be balanced. And so talk a little bit about how do you cover a controversial issue? How do you be tough? How do you hold the public officials accountable and yet not inflame a situation and make it worse? How do you approach that?
I think my editing style and leadership style is really to try to get and build consensus within my team. I just don't ever feel like me making a decision by myself is ever a smart move, especially when it comes to controversial topics or stories. When we go about a controversial story, it starts at the very beginning of story planning. What are our photos going to be? Who are we going to talk to? How can we represent each of the sides well? What do we do? And this is happening more and more recently as well, when some of these public officials refuse to talk to us. There are legislators and county and city government folks that refuse to talk to any single reporter at this point. And it's very, very difficult to tell both or all sides of a story when folks refuse to speak with you. So that's a challenge. How do we as a staff don't have a photographer, so how can we get something that is going to illustrate this story fairly? It's hard with things like abortion debates and police shootings and things like that to have one photo as your main thing when there's a lot of different conversations going on and different viewpoints that are represented. So if I have a protest sign of pro-life stance, I try to, within the next few paragraphs in the body of the story, try to represent the other side. There are things that we do that I don't know that the public really sees, that we're trying to get to there, trying to represent the sides. But then I think when we talk about things like white supremacy, are there two sides to that story? How do we tell people what's going on in these communities without giving a megaphone to literal Nazis? It is something that we have to talk about as a staff. Who do we quote? How do we quote them? How do we, I see people on Twitter all the time that wish we could use more forceful language when we're talking about some of these issues. But there's libel law to deal with. If you call someone a Nazi and they're not a Nazi, they can sue you for those things. So we have to be very, very specific and careful with the words that we use, and how we describe things. Obviously, in this country, people are not guilty of a crime until they've been convicted of those things. So we have to take those things into account, even when it's obvious that an 18-year-old went into a Texas school shooter or a school and was a shooter and killed 19 people, 19 kids. It's just, we have to be careful with those kind of things. And I think sometimes the public gets frustrated with what they feel like is us not being aggressive enough in some of those points. I always just feel like if we've made everyone on all sides equally mad, we've probably done it right, because you can't make anybody happy in this industry. And so I feel like if we're getting feedback from conservatives and liberal folks, then it usually indicates that we've hit somewhere the sweet spot in the middle.
I think most people don't appreciate the nuance that goes into even what seems like really easy decision making. Covering a story, headline, photo placement. Those are all nuances you weigh with every story. And I know that the public doesn't understand that even when we screw up, we in the media screw up, we don't set out to screw up, right? We have systems in place where we are trying to get these things right. And Clint, we talked a little bit before about how these kind of stories can give Idaho, North Idaho, other parts of Idaho, a black eye. So and you've dealt with issues of white supremacy and racism and those kind of stories in North Idaho. How do you balance the nuance in covering them completely and thoroughly and aggressively, and also wondering about the way you're going to portray your community and your state?
It's a great question. I think it's one that we struggle with more often than we'd like. North Idaho in general, isn't as we may be portrayed in the media, and I should say in the larger scope media. As we look at, as I just said that, as I look at, especially this last weekend, this was of international interest, and it's just kind of been one of those recurring themes. And I think every place has its challenges. I think every place has its issues. 21 years ago, this area of the country got a lot of attention for that specific topic. But I think those of us that live here, and especially people that are from here and take a lot of pride in North Idaho and in being an Idaho resident in general, really are working overtime to make sure that that's not the only message that gets out there, and really struggling with that message too, making sure that we are all on the same page with how we describe and talk about this area, 98% of the time, because we need to build the confidence and we need to build the knowledge that other 2%, people know better. I will say, as far as trying to be as balanced as possible, reporting the facts and getting off the topic when it's just not necessary to continue to report on it, is probably our best policy. And the reason for that, I believe, is anyone who has a distinct interest in whatever that topic may be, is going to find it in another venue, another avenue of media. And as we discussed, last week when we talked, more and more of those are popping up every day. And, they're getting to the niche that is very interested in the extreme. And I feel like there's so much of that now, that for us to do our job as a community watchdog, bringing micro local news and information to our readers, the community, making sure we keep the business community healthy, making sure that we provide a voice that truly is as balanced as possible, has got to be job number one.
Bill, can I add something to what Clint's saying there?
Sure, yeah.
I had one of the national cable outlets on behind me today, and they were talking about the events up in Coeur d'Alene. And I mean, literally, you had people, and the whole thing, they didn't know how to say it. And you know, and then they strung together. There was a couple of incidents down here in Boise that were entirely unrelated within the last couple of weeks, and they strung it all together, and it was like, look at Idaho. Well, somebody who's never been here and lives in New York and is used to things being very close together on that side of the map, they aren't all the same. And one of the things that has been interesting in the last few years is this kind of nationalization of media. And we, leading up to the election, I know Christina paid probably as close of attention as I did to this, which was, there was this cottage industry of national news publications writing about Idaho's politics. And there was one story that ran that said, you know, Idaho's going to be a purple state in a few years. I was kind of laughed at that when I don't know if that's going to be the case. And then another story that basically the premise that came out the day, you know, Idaho's going to be a white ethnic ethno state. I was like, I don't know if that's going to be the case either, right? But it's easy for national outlets to kind of parachute in, maybe not even send somebody here, talk about things, roll it all up and be like, look at Idaho, look at the freak show. And that is why I believe really strongly in what we're doing in these local communities, because that local information you're not going to get from MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to get that. And in fact, the panel discussion that I was watching or listening to on the cable channel today, I would bet in large part was predicated on the facts that Clint's journalists were digging up in his town. And that's how this works. We're here to do the work in the local communities, to find the facts, to help people have that context. We have an ad for one of our reporters, Margaret, and it says, what they said, what they did, why it matters. And that's what we do here, so that people can understand what's happening in their community. They have to have a common set of facts. And there are some, what I call pink slime sites out there, primarily on the right side of the spectrum, but also on the left, that look like news, kind of talk like news a little bit, but are opinion in disguise. And we're seeing more of that. And it makes it harder and harder for all of us to have a common set of facts.
You know, when I was back at the Statesman, we used to keep a running tally of all the national publications that would do these big stories about Idaho, and the lead was invariably Idaho. It's more than potatoes, and then you see that over and over and over again. But you know, sticking on that theme, maybe I'll start with you, Don, then go to Christina and Clint. You know, it's not just that we have people come to town and misrepresent Idaho. Idaho journalists end up dealing with attitudes toward national media. So you may or may not ever report about abortion, but people who are angry about a polarized national media and reporting are angry at journalists in general. So we here in the state have to deal with an attitude toward journalists and media that may be not of our making. Is that what you found, Don?
Yeah, and we in our kind of setup conversation, one of the things I said that I think a lot about is the media industry deserves some of the scorn. And I think it's really important to not say like, we're innocent, we're just doing our best. And we are just doing our best, right? But the media landscape has changed really dramatically in the last couple of decades. And there are national polling pieces of data that shows that the general public doesn't even really know or understand. And, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I'm not sure which cable channel it was, but there was a clip that was like, you know, these rich journalists. and it was funny because I follow a lot of journalists on social media, and they were all like, do you want to see my bank account? Like, I'm not rich, right? Like, we're not elites. We're all just making.
Go look at a parking lot at a news station or a newspaper and look at the cars.
It's true. It's true. If the newspaper has a parking lot, right?
Right.
And so I think it's important to not say that the media is perfect, that journalists are perfect, because they're not. And
Sure.
lots of mistakes have been made in the last few decades. You know, I worked at a traditional news outlet for 17 years here in town, and I left because I was tired of big corporate media in large part. And that's kind of the thing, right? It's big, it's big and corporate. What's interesting about this discussion is all three of us are locally controlled, right? Christina is the decider for the Idaho Capital Sun. I'm the decider for Boise Dev, and Clint is the decider for Coeur d'Alene Press. But I'll tell you what, the decider for most of the traditional outlets isn't necessarily even here. They're owned by companies in DC and in California. And that changes that dynamic. And that's why you see, if you watch your evening newscast, you see things that don't really have anything to do with Idaho, or you pick up your newspaper and you see things that are like, well, what's this,
Right.
what's this wire service telling me?
Right.
And so I think it's all kind of tied together, that the media landscape has shifted. It means a change in how the news is produced. It means that there have been some, I think, black eyes for the media. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of us are trying to course correct and recenter on the audience.
I'm going to go to Christina, but I just want to remind our audience that if they have a question for one of our panelists, they can drop it in the Q&A queue, hit the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can shoot that question to me here. So Christina, you have experienced both independent nonprofit now and having worked for a big national company. How do you kind of view that relationship and what we in Idaho deal with?
Well,
That's a big sigh. That's a big sigh. That's a big sigh, Christina.
Yeah, I have worked at newspapers, small and large. I have worked for companies, small and large. And I will say that my most positive experiences have been at family-owned newspapers or in this new nonprofit world that I'm living in. I feel incredibly less beholden to goals set by folks that have set foot maybe in our newsrooms, maybe once or twice, those sort of things. It's extremely hard to make story decisions when you have smaller and smaller staffs, which is something that I hope we talk a little bit about.
Yeah.
That just the newsrooms themselves have changed over the last 20 years. There's far fewer of us doing this work that were 20 years ago and things like that. And so at some point you do have to make very interesting, very hard decisions about what you dedicate your resources to. And in a corporate sort of environment, those ideas are much different than perhaps what I do at the Idaho Capital Sun now, where we do write up little briefs on how you can testify with ITD about electric charging stations for vehicles, where you can show up to how you can show up to a public hearing if you're interested in what your health district is doing with masks, those sort of things. Whereas those things in a big corporate environment, they're not going to have the splashiest, sexiest headline, so we don't do them anymore. And it's very, very difficult to make those decisions when you're dealing with people who skew younger in our newsrooms, who have less experience, that they are looking for their story of the day. And if they get a press release, they can just rewrite it and that's it. We don't have experienced 20-year, 30-year, 40-year veterans in our newsrooms anymore. And it hampers the content that comes out of them. So I felt like I was kind of rambling on that one, but yeah.
Well, you raised some really good points that I hope we can do a deep dive into
Okay.
in just a minute. And Clint, any thoughts about kind of how we in Idaho deal with attitudes that are often generated by cable TV and national news media that may or may not have anything to do with the work you and your staff are doing?
Well, I think a lot of this comes back to sometimes opinion. And we may be touching on this down the road. Yeah. I'll just save it because I think that's something that we definitely should spend some time on. But I would have to agree with Christina that the expertise on our journalists journalism teams, I think is sometimes to our benefit because they look at things with a fresh eye. But to our detriment when we do have mistakes made. We don't have the beat and source relationships that those experienced long time journalists have in many of our communities, and fostering relationships internally so that
Yeah.
these journalists want to stay with us and continue to grow, because we know we're all a training ground for the next big thing, especially when we've got the new guys right out of school. So I would agree. I think that that doesn't help us when it comes to dealing with that attitude. And that's where I feel like when we jump into the opinion piece, I think this is very related.
So lots to talk about. I wanted to just touch on something that Christina mentioned before, and then we'll move on. But Clint and Dawn, are you running into people who will no longer talk to reporters? I mean, that's got to be a pretty dark day when you're trying to tell all the sides of a story and some of those sides aren't talking anymore. Clint and then Dawn, have you run into that?
You know, I can't think of anything specific off the top of my head. We have definitely run into people who want to balance record, so they're recording the same conversation so that they can refute it. Especially
I've had that
because
too.
that our journalists, you know, sometimes don't have those relationships, and they're not really sure who they're talking to and how that's going to play out. You know, I guess in my opinion, we're seeing a lot more of the double check. We're seeing a lot more of the skepticism on, will you report this, you know, through a balanced lens, or are you going to put a spin on it as soon as it goes in? People don't understand the difference between, you know, the sensational reporter and a journalist who, you know, main objective is to remain unbiased as, you know, as often as possible.
Well, and as Don pointed out, not all journalists, deserve credibility and trust. And so you have to spend the time on the beat to earn it and and for people to get to know you. And we all often aren't in that situation anymore with our staffs. Don, are people not talking?
You know, I would say not for the reasons we're discussing here. Almost never. Sometimes people won't talk because they don't want to talk about what we're asking about, and so there's that. But
right, when you're asking sometimes for proprietary information about development, about markets, about business plans.
Yeah, I mean, people often are like, the thing we run into the most is we write about things that people don't want us to write about a lot.
Yeah,
and it's not even earth-shattering things. I will tell you a story that I think is on this topic, though. We had a story that we did about 6 weeks ago, and a person quoted in the story, who's an elected official, went on their Facebook page with the link and said, "I was horribly misquoted by Boise Dev," and so I was alerted to this by someone else, and I hopped in there and went into the comments and said, "Hey, I take that really seriously." Engaged with them, took them at their face value, and the individual, I also messaged the individual, and they couldn't say at that exact moment what was wrong, which was the first red flag. And I said, well, you know, my reporter on this recorded the conversation, and I said, you know, it's funny because one of your peers has told me in the past of this reporter, could they not quote me quite so precisely? Could they take out the so's and ums? And I was like, fair point. And the person who'd complained on Facebook went, "I was being recorded?" And I went, "Yep. And in fact, you can hear you acknowledging that at the very beginning of the recording." And they said, "I didn't know that." And I was like, "Well, you did, because I can hear it on the tape." And all of a sudden, the complaints about the problems with the story went away. There was one like really minor thing that I think was a misinterpretation. And they said, "Well, I'm going to follow up with you with all my other complaints." And it's been 6 weeks and I haven't heard. And so, you know, yeah, I think you will have people sometimes, and they said they wouldn't talk to us again in the future. And I was like, well, I don't really want to quote you again in the future anyway, because this is what you're going to do to us. And so, yeah, I think it's possible, but for the most part, we haven't had a lot of trouble with that just yet, but it could be coming.
Well, I think we're seeing some of that. People have decided they cannot talk to the press and then claim that their side's not being reflected. And as we saw statewide, we had fewer and fewer Idaho politicians want to participate in debates. So that's another place where they're choosing not to communicate in a setting where that was really traditional before. So changing face of media, Christina, let's go to you. You know, you talked about younger staffs, less experienced staffs, fewer reporters with gray in their beard. And how is that affecting the stories you do and the kind of work you do, and the kind of nuance and sophistication you want to see in your reporting?
Yeah, it looks like we have a question in here about what is a nonprofit newspaper. So I'm gonna answer that really fast.
Okay.
It asks where we get our income source. So the Idaho Capital Sun is a part of a national consortium under the nonprofit umbrella of an organization called States Newsroom. And we rely solely on donations and grant funding to pay for our reporters and our reporting. So it's all donation based, grant based, those sort of things. There's a lot of really exciting examples of community funded journalism that are starting to spring up that we can talk more about if we have time, but that's kind of the basics.
Well, and Christina, there's also now there's nonprofit or foundation reporting going to some for-profit media. So you might have
Correct.
You might have a newspaper company that's getting additional reporting staff from some of these nonprofit institutions that want to see reporting beefed up.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Could you rephrase your first question again? I forgot what I'm.
We're just talking. You kind of introduced this notion of the evolving nature nature of staff, and we talk about experience and youth, which can be good and bad. But I think you were talking about nuance, sophistication, source development. So how are you kind of wrestling with those issues in your newsroom?
Yeah, I would say that it affects the Idaho Capital Sun a lot less than some of the other newsrooms that I've been in, because all of our reporters have been in Idaho for, if they're not from here, they've been in here for 15 years and have been reporting here. So what we see in the industry is, that your annual income, your annual wages are not keeping up with what people need to survive. Like many other industries, I made $10 an hour for most of my reporting career. It led to a lot of credit card debt that I am officially finally out of, but these are real things that reporters face to do this job. I went into editing. I applied for the assistant editing position at the Idaho Press because I could no longer afford to be a reporter. I didn't have the experience that I thought I needed to be able to help other people in their writing. But I did it simply because I needed the money. And so when that's happening in newsroom after newsroom, nationwide, statewide, we just have a less experienced media corps out there covering things. We don't understand. I tell young reporters all the time that the city council and what they're discussing didn't just pop up the day that you walked into City Hall. There's literally hundreds of years behind you that you've got to figure out like how the heck you got to here. How we're still talking about some of this stuff for 20 years. I just assigned a story today to a reporter that I worked at the Moscow Pullman Daily News in 2009, and that stretch of highway still isn't built. But knowing that history and knowing that it's the environmental impact study that has tripped that project up for years, meanwhile there's fatalities all over the place on that stretch of highway. How can we offer those pieces of context if you yourself don't know them? You don't know what you don't know. And so when we have very young people in these newsrooms who don't have mentors that have been doing this for 40 years, it's harder and harder to put together cohesive, contextual, in-depth, data-focused stories because you just don't know the backstory. Because we see a lot of people leave the industry for things like PR jobs and stuff like that because it pays better. Benefits are abysmal in the newspaper industry. McClatchy, which owns the Idaho Statesman, just barely started offering parental leave. These are sort of the things that in normal industries you kind of assume are there. And we write about parental leave for other industries all the time, but do we have it ourselves? These are things I think, especially after the pandemic, where people are looking for better jobs, better quality of life, sort of things, and we're losing people to better paying jobs, and people just cycle out of newsrooms. A lot of times the only way to get a promotion in a newsroom is to go somewhere else, is to physically move you, yourself, and your family to a different state to start there because you can't get a raise where you are. So it affects the coverage in big ways that I don't think a lot of people are aware of.
I'm going to go to Clint next, but I just was going to note that our friend Jane Suggs in the online chat did vote for did cast a vote for graybeards and said that they have experience that's helpful on local issues and political issues. So thank you, Jane. Clint, I know, small market newspapers and TV stations, it's a constant struggle to get and keep staff. So talk about challenges you face. You have multiple newspapers in North Idaho and Washington State.
Well, and I know it's not a unique issue, so I'm sure I don't have any, revolutionary solutions. But, one of the things that we absolutely had to do coming out of the COVID era, and all of the economic things that were associated with that, was take a look at our base entry, and all over the company, in fact, from the mailroom to our editorial folks to our entry level sales executives, and talk about how much it costs us to retrain, and how much the attrition of losing these people really costs us overall. It's a huge investment. And as we look at we still have a business to run. We are certainly in a business that needs to be in the black, and it's hard to make tough choices to make sure that we are as competitive as we can be here in North Idaho. And I'm assuming all of us are in this boat. We just hired someone from Taco Bell that's taking a pay cut. And that's, the hours are better. And when you think about it, when Taco Bell's paying their management team $21, $25 an hour, that's hey, that's great, fantastic. I'm not criticizing. It's tough for us to bring those entry level, especially leadership positions, into range. And then you start bringing somebody out of college with a journalism degree that has a mountain of student loan debt, and now they're looking at housing, which is really out of range in most of our markets. And they're thinking, gosh, I cannot make less than X per year. And there's a big delta between where we're at in some of those cases. So we're really trying to catch that up aggressively. Kind of additionally looking at, other alternatives, like do any of our employees have rental properties that we can potentially work with as part of the package? Anybody across our company, we're pretty well diversified, have a lot of people, is there a subsidy that, might come into play down the road as an employer? Our benefits package is phenomenal, and one of the best benefits packages in the industry. But usually a 23-year-old's kind of not thinking about long-term care insurance. Those are the kinds of things that we really need to aim now for what's important: flexible scheduling, making sure that we give our employees the ability to work where it's convenient, as long as the work's getting done. That's very anti-industry, if you will. We're the kind of business that, especially on the business side of things, we're 8 to 5. You take a hour lunch, you check in here and there. Our reporters are on the beat, then they're back in the office, and they file their stories from here. We don't have to be that way anymore. We need to make this accessible to the people that have a passion to grow with the industry and the job, because we aren't going to be growing any more senior level reporters if we don't, because we have to give people a reason to love it first.
I just want to add something here, and I'm gonna brag on myself. I'm gonna brag on Christina, and it applies to Clint. I can tell from what he just said. The Idaho Capital Sun and Boise Dev pay reporters above market, and I'm really proud of that. And every dollar there are no loans, there are no outside investors here. Every dollar that has come through here has been earned from memberships or ads. And it's just really important to pay people well, and pay people better than they're getting paid elsewhere. One, it's a competitive advantage, right? I have some people on my staff. I hired one, and they're like, "How did you hire that person?" And I was like, "It wasn't hard. I just paid him a good wage." And I know that the Capital Sun has put some focus into that as well. And it's really stinking important. I haven't had any turnover. I'm going to have a bunch because I keep saying this out loud. I haven't had any turnover at all. I've never had anybody quit. And people are starting to hit their 2-year anniversaries working with me. And it's because of a couple of factors. One, we pay better. And 2, we just treat people better. And it's really important. And that's why supporting journalism is really important. Supporting what the Coeur d'Alene Press does, supporting what the Capital Sun does. Please, hopefully support Boise Dev, because I'm not here to send all my money back to DC for a hedge fund, which is what owns a lot of local news, or stockholders. I'm here to invest in my community, a community I grew up in and love. And it is different. It does matter. Investing in these people will keep them around longer because they can afford to live. And we're all in an inflationary environment where I handed out raises in the spring, and I'm like, I think I need to do some more adjusting, because it's a tough environment for people to find housing and wages.
Well, Don, let's talk about, being an entrepreneur as well as a news executive. You started what, 5 years ago, and it was just you. And so our theme is the changing face of media in Idaho. One of the things that's changing is startups like yours, Idaho Ed News, East Idaho News, Christina's Pub. We have a lot of digital startups that either have little or no print presence and are carving out niches and finding successes. So talk about how you kind of conceptualize that and how you've made it a success that you're using our platform to brag about.
Bill, it was an accident. It was an accident. And so I worked at Channel 7 here in Boise, the NBC affiliate, and I left the newsroom in 2010 and I moved over to manage digital sales. And I was trying to find leads for my sales staff. And also I just was like, well, I got to tweet about something now. All right, what do I do with this Twitter thing? And so I would tweet these little Boise Dev items. I see Christina laughing, but she knows it's true. And they were really popular. And I had a friend of mine be like, I love your Boise Dev tweets. It's the only thing I go on Twitter for. I can't find them all. And I went, So I started an email list before I'd left Channel 7. And then 2016, I was like, I've had enough of the corporate life. I'm going to go. And I was going to start a digital marketing business and started that up. And starting a business is hard and takes time. And I was bored. And so I'm like, well, let's just put together a little website of this Boise Dev stuff. And it kind of started to work. I was able to do a journalism fellowship at Stanford in California for a year, where they basically paid me to think and look at local news. And I spent that time going, how can we make this better? How can we do things that are different? And how can we do it without a paywall? We don't have a paywall because I don't want one. And I don't want to put barriers up, but I have to fund this whole deal, right? And so I came back in 2018 and kind of started it full time, and the pandemic happened. And I'll tell you, that year my goal was to hire a person, and I didn't even know it was possible. And I hired 3 that year, and then I hired another one the next year. And it turned out that our mix, I wouldn't probably name it Boise Dev if I had it to do over again, because it's not just Boise and it's not just development, but people wanted to know what was happening in their neighborhood.
And that was a moment when Boise was exploding.
Yeah, and honestly, we kind of started
happening.
like just before it really took off. And the things that we're talking about, I didn't foresee. There was this moment, and there was a kind of a snarky journalist on Twitter. They didn't even mention me. I happened to see it, and they said something like, "Oh, is Don going to write about the Wendy's opening?" I saw that, and I remember being like, "What? That's not cool." And I remember being bothered by it, like, "Oh, I'm not doing this important work." But what it turns out is that, I did a story yesterday about a new McDonald's in Star, and you know what the most read story on our website is today? It's the new McDonald's in Star. And that was a light bulb to me to say, you know what? I've been in this industry a long time. I came out of, and I'm not denigrating my former employer at all, but I came out of a place, because it's really common, where the approach was, we are the journalists, we are trained, we're going to tell you what's important. And I've tried to flip that around. We did some billboards a couple of years ago, and they said, local news, locally owned, we put readers first. And it's my belief that that is where we have to go as an industry. We have to put our readers at the center. We have to answer their questions. We have to give them what they are wanting to know about. And we do a lot of stories around here that don't do a lot of traffic, that aren't the McDonald's and Star. but my reporters, we talk about generally what's popular, but there's no quota. I greenlight stories all the time that in my head, I go, that's not going to get a lot of reads. But there's an interesting, it's almost an inverse relationship between stories that convert to members for us, so people who are willing to pay for our premium service, and popularity. It's this fascinating thing where stories that don't get a ton of reads convert and turn people into paying customers. And so we try and balance those things and do journalism that is important, that may not always be super popular, but also do journalism that's popular and isn't always important.
So I want to ask Christina kind of the same story, and then we'll go to Clint as well. But Don, you started with plant P&Z and growth and development, but you've focused in on general city government and even city politics. Why did you expand into that
all
area?
These things? One, market opportunity. I saw that there was a gap in coverage in this market of development at first. There wasn't any, or there was a little bit, but it was, and really not, and even what was there was very blithe. And so I saw that gap. The gap is, we've got a lot of competition now. We're not the only ones that cover development anymore. But then all these things started to happen around it. In Boise, the big contentious issues of like 2018, 2019 were, we're going to build a stadium, or we're going to build a library, or we're going to build a trolley downtown. So I was like, well, we need to start covering the city council and the mayor, because that's where those things happened. So that kind of glommed on, because that was development. And then it was like, well, we need to probably do some business coverage, because that's related, and startups. And so we started to kind of do all these things. And so now for us, it's development, growth, civics, business. Last year, about a year ago, we launched a product called Idaho First. It's a morning newsletter that comes out every day. And it is designed to give people kind of everything they need to know for the day. And we hired Gretchen Parsons, and she writes what we internally call ABC. And it's kind of the 3 most interesting, important stories of the day that she writes. It gives you the best of us, but it also gives links out to good stuff from the Capital Sun or the Statesman or Channel 2 or Channel 7 and events. And then we put a pet of the day in there. That's the most popular thing I've done in my entire career. And so we've now tiptoed into, like, we're really trying to give you a holistic look at the market, which isn't where we started, but it's all focused on what the reader wants. And I've talked too much, so I'm going to let Christina go.
So Christina, you a different but similar story. You started, you stood Capital Sun up from scratch. So talk about how you did that.
I don't think it would have happened if I didn't have a very kind of abrupt speed bump in my career. I was fired, and so Google my name, you'll find it. From the Idaho Statesman. I was fired from the Idaho Statesman. And I really genuinely thought, like, okay, here's my sign.
Christina, you should say why. You should say why, because I think people should know why, that it wasn't like bad.
I didn't do anything illegal or harm anyone in any kind of way, so that's good. I did tweet about how our newsroom was struggling to get access to basic office equipment like the Microsoft suite, including Excel, which a reporter needed to download and interpret census data. And so I genuinely thought, like, I've been really stressed out with journalism for a long time. Maybe this is my my sign to go do something else with my life, go be the librarian that my mom told me to be. And that's what I thought I was doing. I was looking up master's programs to go get my master. I thought, okay, here we go. And Twitter was also the thing that got me my new job. So I went to this journalism conference in college and met this girl, and she connected me with State's Newsroom. And the thing that was most interesting about that was she just, my boss just let me talk. She just let me say what Idaho needed, what I was frustrated with in the Idaho journalism landscape. What do Idahoans need to know about that they're not getting? And I just had a lot of ideas about that. I've covered state and local politics almost exclusively my whole career, and really genuinely do believe that lawmakers and voters make better decisions when they have factual information at their fingertips. And so we can't know what we're voting on if we don't have reporters putting stories together on how these things come to be, who's paying who to make these decisions, all of that sort of stuff. And so so my boss basically said, I think you have more journalism in you, even though you think you don't, you know, and it was like, I don't know. And so I went off to the mountains for the weekend and I walked around and tried to get my feet under me. And I thought there is stuff, and I don't want to be a journalist anywhere else. I don't want to go work for the New York Times or for the Houston Chronicle or little tiny papers elsewhere. I want to be a journalist in Idaho. I care about this place. I care about telling these stories, not somebody else's. And so I started kind of asking around to the folks that I thought, if I could build a dream team, I can do this, you know, and I really genuinely did get to do that. I got to build a team that is very experienced, that I knew that I worked well with, and that we could really do some interesting journalism. And then it's basically telling our story and saying we do have a different funding model than other folks. We don't have a paywall. We don't have a traditional subscription that you sign up for, and it really is hoping that we put enough good work out there that people see it, people notice it, people see that it's, I think, exceptional, I think very well done, and can offer a lot to other folks. The other thing that's really cool about our product that I'm really proud of is that we allow any other news outlet to pick up our work with proper credit. And it's because I have worked at the Moscow Pullman Daily News, I have worked at the Idaho Press, I have worked at the Idaho Falls newspaper, where we have our budget meetings and we talk about the stories for the day, and inevitably something is left behind. There is never enough of us, enough reporters to get to the stories of the day, and it breaks my heart. It kept me up at night at the Statesman, it kept me up at night at the Idaho Press. So if we can help, there used to be, every newspaper used to send a state house reporter to Boise to cover the legislative session. That does not happen anymore. How can we be, how can taxpayers know what's going on and how their money is being used if no one is there watching this stuff every day? And you do, and like Don says, you do have to be there every day. You have to sit through the city council meetings. You have to sit through all the hearings at the legislature to know what the heck is going on and to put that in context. And it helps when you've got like the Clark Corbins of the world, who's on our staff, who has literally done that every session for more than a decade. And he can remember, Clark can predict whatever is going to happen inevitably. Like, he just knows because he has been watching it for long enough and he knows his sources well enough to know how the votes are going to go and things like that. So that's the quick and dirty on the Idaho Capital Sun. I'm really proud of what we do, and I'm really grateful to the newspapers that see the value in our work and pick up our stuff.
So Christina, quickly, how big is your staff now, and is your funding, is it year to year? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? How long do you have to prove it a success? How will that work?
None of my bosses have ever put a cap on it. So they told me to get a 2-year lease for our office. I felt like that was a good sign. I actively have conversations more on one-on-one levels. Sometimes we'll do call outs for donations and things, like just reminders of it does take human beings to do this, and it isn't just slapping a press release on Facebook so everybody can see it. There's work that goes into what we do. And so I'm genuinely hopeful that we'll be around for a long time. States Newsroom is expanding. It has a plan to be in all 50 states in some capacity by 2025. Idaho was the 21st state newsroom, and I think we're up to 27. And we're onboarding reporters and editors for places like Arkansas, Indiana. We just launched in Alaska, those sort of things.
And the
so I feel good about where we are.
Size of your staff is?
Yes. So there's one editor, me, and 3 full-time reporters. And then we also added our first intern this summer. So I'm really genuinely excited about that. And Idaho Capital Sun was also selected for the new VOCES internship of Idaho, which places Latino students in newsrooms to make sure that we're addressing Latino issues in our reporting.
Good, thank you. So Clint, how you're more traditional media, how do you view the startups that are they competition, or are they augmenting Idaho journalism? Are they a threat to you? How do you view startups like Christina's and Don's?
Well, I think it depends on what startup it is. As we look at our partnerships here on the panel today, I think there are ways that Don, Christina, and I can work together very, very productively. You know, I think gone are the days where our journalism, particularly well done journalism, is absolutely proprietarily our own. I feel like if we can partner and build stronger products independently, especially those of us whose maybe markets don't touch, you know, as far as the advertising dollars goes, that's usually where it gets a little iffy. But you know, I really feel like quality journalism, quality content, we should be partnering, because I may have something you're interested in. You're doing something that maybe we don't do or don't do as well. Just like Capitol coverage, you know, having a partnership with the Statesman, you know, it's been great for us. I don't have to have a Capitol assignment, and you know, though we don't really use a whole lot of content outside of when we're in legislatures in session, you know, it's still valuable content. And you know, as I look at, you know, like Boise Dev, and we look at Capital Sun News, I think there's really more we can be doing. And it goes further than that. I think this goes further than our core products. Maybe this complements some of our niche products, some of the things that we do annually, whatever those may be. So I don't feel there's the journalism competition with quality, well done content. Now, I think where it does get a little dicey is the edge of the spectrum, right? And people are, you know, these products or online, mostly now online products, they seem to pull eyeballs and readership because people only want to read what they 100% agree with. And unfortunately, in a traditional media, that's not necessarily our content every day. You know, depending on, you know, what the issue may be, but you know, Coeur d'Alene Press, for example, you know, it's a 130-year history at this point. My time with this paper, even if I'm here for 30 years, you know, it's just a drop in the bucket. I'm just a steward of this organization for a while, and it's my job to leave it better than I found it. And I think navigating a time like we're in right now, it's really imperative that we meet the reader where the reader wants to be, and we bring the reader a different level of content that they can't find anywhere else. That micro local news and information that isn't necessarily opinion pieces or isn't necessarily skewed one way or the other. We're telling the reader what to think. I think it's more about, gosh, look at what a great place we live in, or this is what's happening politically, or growth, infrastructure. You know, those are the things that we do such a great job putting together. And I think that if we stay on mission, then our core tangible products, I think our digital edition, our website, our apps, you know, all the niche products that we put out, and even the newsletters that go daily, you know, I think they become as valuable to the reader as they've ever been. You know, I think we talked when we prepped for this call last week, our readership right now is the numbers are higher than they've ever been. You know, we're engaging people at a much different level. Now, sometimes the core tangible product might not show that in a physical number. But if we measure our audience in a more sophisticated way, and we reach to our audience in a more sophisticated way, they engage with us differently. And our reader, you know, as we discussed before, isn't just in our backyard anymore. You know, people that have moved away, that care about the community, they can follow every day without having to wait 3 days for the mail to deliver it. You know, things like that.
So I want to talk about opinion and the way it's influenced both the business and news reporting, but we have a couple questions from viewers that I'd like to try to get through quickly. So the first one is, in the digital reality that is littered with misinformation and social media trolls, how do media institutions deal with online comments and moderation? And what is the line between free speech, public opinion, and harassment? So why don't we go with you, Clint, and then Dawn, and then Christina? Well, and you don't all have to answer. If the person ahead of you says it, you can just give them a thumbs up or a nod and say, great answer.
All right. I think this is a great question. I feel like gosh, it is our job at some point, if we're going to have digital assets, because that's usually where those are going to show up, right? If we have digital assets, we have to moderate what's there. And I don't mean censor what's there, and I don't mean delete comments unnecessarily because we don't agree with them. We have to make sure that people hiding behind the screen and keyboard aren't bullying everyone else for their comment or their take on the situation. Personally, I feel like our website isn't a place for comments. We do, funnel our comments to our posted stories on social media. Well, there it is. The social media animal right there is, you're bound to run into some problems. It's a big concern because you can't keep up, especially with, a big story of like this last weekend, for example. By the time I read the post on social media, which had 793 comments and about, 200 or 300 shares by the time I got to it, we can't catch up. So having somebody, if you're going to post it, it's your story, and we want to put the breaking news up or the really important stuff up in social because it does reach a bigger audience. We need to make sure that we're taking care of our readers. And that's I don't want people to come to our site and feel like they're going to be called a really awful name or bullied to the point where they're afraid. That happens. And I feel like it is our responsibility, just like with letters to the editor, that we make sure that, as best we can, that we, cite or research, any facts that may not seem like they're correct. And, talk to the submitter to make sure that, they understand. We'd like to make sure that we verify. But in addition to, I don't like to, in fact, we won't publish anything that, is just clearly inciting a violent action or calling names or is just misinformation, because I think that makes us responsible. One of the things kind of about that is, letters to the editor are tough. We have a right, we're walking a fine line right there. And I don't want to censor and edit people, but I also don't want to put us in a bad position, which we've been in before, where people think that it's our content when taken out of context and shared virally suddenly in the digital world. And all of a sudden I have people on my team that are, maybe taking a death threat, or we have a bomb threat, things like that. It happens. So
I'll just say simply, we don't have comments on our website. I've kind of had a career-long hatred of those. I think Bill knows. We do have a Facebook group, and we moderate it pretty strongly. We have rules that are really simple. No promotion, no attacks on others, no speculation or false info. And that framework has worked pretty well for us. We're not afraid to delete comments when they break those rules, remove members when they break those rules. And the most powerful tool on Facebook is to just shut the comments off. In fact, when we were covering mask mandates last year, we just instituted a blanket policy that if we had a story about masks, we'd post it to Facebook and shut the comments off. And I would say the reason was, what new is there to say at this point? And people went along with that.
Don, if you start applying the what's new to say about that on every story on social media, it might shut social media down.
Yeah.
Christina.
I kind of take a different approach. I don't look at the comments once. I don't look at them at all. I don't care. Like, I genuinely, no good can come from that space. It's not good for my mental health. We have rules that are baked into the back of the Facebook about profanity and certain terms, that if you use them automatically, your comment is hidden. We don't have comments on our website. If you really have a genuine question about our reporting or something like that, my email is publicly available and you can find it there, and I'll answer it in a workspace. But I don't read the comments because I think it's the most vile place on the internet, and I can't stomach what I see there. I don't think it's a positive place to reflect myself or our reporting.
From our Humanities Council board member, Kenton Bird, who is a journalism professor, he shared this question for all three panelists. Thanks for your commitment to local news. Of your reporting in the past year, what story or series are you most proud of? And on the flip side, what's the big one that got away or didn't get the coverage it deserved? So why don't we start with you, Christina? Big story, most proud of, and the one that got away.
There's a lot of work that I'm really proud of, but I think toward the end of last year and the beginning of the legislative session, we ran a series about how our foster care system is completely overrun and under-equipped to be able to handle the folks that are seeking care through the foster system. Our reporting led to a JFAC, the budget committee in the legislature, appointing about 20, I think it was 21 or 24 new employees for that system. And we had legislators thank us and say, we didn't know about this until you wrote about it. And that is what we are here for. That is the difference that we are trying to make. I will read every one of those types of comments because I do think that, if we can actually impact policy and help people and get people the help they need when they're interacting with government, I think I'm all for that. I think that we're seeing it now that extremism in Idaho is something that we all need to do a better job of covering. I think we've tried to just pretend that this is on the far right of the spectrum, that it's the fringes, that they don't have the voting blocks to make a difference in the legislature and on school boards and city councils. But I am here to tell you that that is changing. And if we don't address, extremism, white supremacy, racism entering our politics, then we're going to be a hurting unit when it comes to our state in the next 5 to 10 years. I really genuinely believe now is the moment to really double down on some of our coverage of this. And I think the Coeur d'Alene incident this weekend really opened my eyes to some of that. I think we want to walk around and pretend that this isn't us, this isn't our state, this isn't who we are, but people out there perceive this as a safe haven for these folks, and we have to do a better job of saying and showing that this is not who we are, that this is not what we want here, that these are not the type of policies that we will accept as Idahoans.
Clint, same question to you.
Well, I completely agree with what Christina has to say. I think that, it's incredibly important that, what we do, every single day is make our place better and our products better and our communities better, period. But, as I look at what I'm most proud of personally, I think the way we covered COVID for 2 years, basically 18 months really, was all about localizing it. And we made that decision right away in the beginning. You can get the national coverage of COVID anywhere else. And, that's not our hedgehog, if you want to quote Dan Collins. I think but what we did is we really tried to look at how it was affecting our community locally. This was a very unique part of the country for that as well. Suddenly, when the sheltering was over and we were all let out of quarantine, this place exploded. There were tourists driving in from everywhere. Our hospitality sector and entertainment here just went crazy. Now, of course, it reflected in the numbers later, but those things aside, we wanted to really make sure that we were trying to localize it and be different. What's already been said has been said. And, I think that's an excellent point for this evening. But so that's what I'm most proud of. But weirdly enough, kind of like Don talked about his stories, the biggest story that we wrote, and I just looked this up while you're talking, that we wrote last year was a stay-at-home dad's take on helping his kids get through the COVID crunch and fear and school missing. And it was huge. It literally almost 2 times any other local content story that we wrote. Wow. And it was just really a human piece from his point of view and how he worked with his kids and what he felt like that did. So I think those things we do a great job on.
Well, connecting human beings to humanity is always been something that was successful in journalism. Don, the best story and the one that got away.
So I'm gonna say this. I think overall our work, I was just going to see what my most read story was last year because I don't actually know. Oh, it was a Christmas tree getting cut down. That's not my favorite.
Head of the day. Yeah,
pretty much. No, so I think that our work on the housing affordability situation in the Treasure Valley has been really important. There's more we can do. I'm going to say something. Christina's heard me say this a bunch, and Christina knows what I'm talking about. She's one of the few people out there that does. we are working on a really significant story that I've had reporters on since January. That is one of the biggest stories of my career. And I can't tell you what it is yet because it's not done, and I'm hoping really soon. But you talk about partnerships. It's a story that we've agreed, if they so choose, to let the Idaho Capital Sun run, and I'm really hoping to have that here really quickly. So the story I'm most proud of isn't done yet, and it's driving me crazy.
Okay, that's a cheap shot, Dawn.
Oh, it is, and I tease it. Christine and I did an event in April, and I kind of did the same dog and pony show.
Right, and I think we should make it clear that it's not IKEA coming or something, so people don't get too excited.
Yeah, well, and it's not. It's something that's how do I characterize it? It is something that I think is a significant problem that put lives at risk. I'll just say that. And it's the one that got away. I know we have Jane Suggs watching, and she'll laugh at this. So when I started Boise Dev, people would ask me two things: when are we getting an In-N-Out? When are we getting an IKEA? We're not getting IKEA. In-N-Out, my reporter Autumn Robertson, I was very proud of her, broke the story of the first location in Meridian. And then about 6 weeks later, an In-N-Out was proposed in Boise, and we got scooped. And I was really, really mad. Really mad. And that was me. That was on me because that's my part of the beat. And we followed the Idaho Statesman, which broke it to their credit, and we followed them. We credited them with getting the scoop, but that was my one that got away.
Getting scooped.
It's good to know that Dawn has been humbled at least once.
Oh, lots. Trust me.
So we have about 8 minutes left, and I know we wanted to loop back around to the notion of opinion reporting, and I think there's two aspects to this, and I'm going to start with Dawn. But how opinions have influenced the public view of journalism, and how opinions have maybe snuck their way into news reporting, and maybe just that understanding the difference between opinion reporting and news reporting and what that's meant to the work we do.
There's an old saying, and there's two versions of this saying. The one that I will quote here is the more polite one, which is, opinions are like belly buttons. Everyone has one, and they are full of junk. I don't like opinions. We don't run opinion content on Boise Dev at all. We did a little bit in the early days. And I just went, this isn't a lane we need to be in. People can get a smorgasbord of opinions on Facebook or Twitter or wherever they want. And so we don't do it. And it's been really, really good for our brand, really good for our brand. People recognize it, they see it, they say it back to me. And so we just don't do it. And I don't see that.
When you say you don't do it, you don't run opinion articles, or you don't let reporters report their opinions, or you keep news stories free of opinion. What do you mean when you say that?
The first two. Now, a news story may have opinion because public officials may express an opinion, right? So that's within the news coverage. But as far as what comes from us, you don't hear my opinion. We don't take submitted opinion pieces. We don't run letters to the editor. On rare occasion, I will break that. It's been 2 years, and it was basically to say, hey, let's not put nasty notes on people's cars with California plates. But even then, honestly, I don't know what it would be again. We don't do it. And it's benefited us because the user, when they see opinion pieces from a news outlet, don't necessarily understand the difference. And even if it says, and Bill, I know you used to be the opinion editor at the Statesman, and I think this dynamic has changed over the last 10 years. Yeah. I don't know that they know the difference between that and news coverage. And so staying out of it has been good for our position and brand.
I think especially online where you don't have a special page that you turn.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to tell for your average person what's opinion and what's not opinion. And of course, so much reporting everywhere has included more opinion in it as well. So Christina, how have you guys approached this question?
We do run commentary on our website. We do run columns and opinion there. I'll write the occasional opinion column myself. I think there's a wide range of the quality of opinion writing that's out there, and I think it's a dying art. Opinion writers in newsrooms used to be the best reporters in the room because they had to be. because they had to base their opinions on fact. They had to know issues inside and out. They had to know how to anticipate people that disagreed with them. And they were on the phone just as much as reporters, talking to officials, getting that information firsthand, those sort of things. And I think we still have those good opinion writers in the US and in Idaho. I think there's a handful of opinion writers that do it really well. However, I do think that Dawn is right that in 2022, everyone has a platform. So if everyone is an expert, no one is an expert. And when we run opinions, it goes back to what Clint was saying, that people want to be reaffirmed in their beliefs. So if we're just putting things out to either make people elated that they're the smartest person in the room and I have the opinion and here's the proof, I agree with this person, or it's the opposite. Here's a way for me to attack you, your news organization, and what you're writing about. We try very hard. I always put when we're I got a call once as an editor for someone who couldn't understand that an opinion was on the physical newspaper opinion page was a column, was an opinion. It was labeled. Even in print, people don't understand this. So throw them onto 17 social media sites and good luck. They don't get it. And so we try really hard to put commentary in all caps as the first lead into any social media post that we do when it comes to our opinion content. It's a slippery slope out there. At some point I could see us not doing it. At some point, I think and Dawn shared with me that there are news organizations, large national chains, that are ratcheting down their opinion content output. And I can see the argument for that. I think we all know people that are close to us and people that we haven't seen since 6th grade. We all know their opinions on everything at this point. And so do we really need that in our products? When I know how my 6th grade best friend feels about abortion, gun rights, school shootings, who's going to be governor, you name it. I know that, and I haven't seen her in 20 years, so it's just like at some point, we've got to let really, really good opinion writers do their thing and I think get out of the way for the rest, but that's how I feel.
I know, Clint, you were talking about, I think it was Gannett has made some decisions on how it's going to treat opinion reporting in its newspapers. So how is it playing out there in Coeur d'Alene?
Well, you made reference to Poynter Institute put this out on the 8th. I just looked up again, but it says that Gannett's scuttling their editorial pages in 250 title chain regional papers. And, when I read that, given the date that it came out, 3 days before this last weekend, with all this stuff going on, it just really resonated that, hey, we really kind of need to look at this. And then discussing this with you guys, you were talking about, Christina, that they have to be the best writer in the room. They also have to have the toughest skin because these guys are taking a beating, for their opinion. And, it's interesting because I it's one of those things that I'm still percolating, I guess. But as I look forward, all of your comments are correct. I mean, there are a million different places that I can go to read exactly what I agree with. And, if it's black and white news, like, there was a fire downtown, here are the details, blah, 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 that's one thing. But for a newspaper to try to set the record straight and try to, it almost becomes a lecture, right? Because it doesn't reflect necessarily the tone of the community sometimes. And I'm really struggling with that because I do think that it doesn't help our readership. I especially when we take a hard stand, that maybe counter community or counter current culture. I feel like there's room for damage at that point. So, where I am, we do have an opinion right now. It's 3 or 4 days a week. In most of our main papers, we also have letters to the editor on the same day. Letters to the editor, I think, are one thing. That's that's letting the readers really weigh in, and share with other people, and maybe even guest opinion. I would agree with too. I just think right now, in the world we live in, we're not saying anything new. We're not necessarily educating an audience that can't otherwise or hasn't otherwise come across that information. And if it hurts us, or hurts our advertising or hurts our readers, why? I just don't know that we need to take those hard stands.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think we could go for another 90 minutes with the three of you. So I've really enjoyed getting this chance to talk to you. I want to thank Clint Schroeder. I want to thank Christina Lords and Don Day for participating in this conversation. I want to thank Margaret Johnson, the Humanities Council Chairwoman, for hosting us, and the staff at the Humanities Council did a great job putting together this series, and the ASL and Spanish language interpreters who've made this more accessible to other viewers. I want to thank them as well. So you can tell your friends if they missed this, they can see the replays of both of our conversations at the Humanities Council website. And I want to thank you all. Good night. Thank you all, and say good night, and see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
guys.
Thanks for having us.